Welcome to the SRA podcast. This is your host, AlexHumva, and we are joined once again by a very special guest, Faye, joining us for our 10th episode. We've completed a season worth of podcasting, if you consider seasons to be base 10 sort of things.
Hi, Alex. Glad to be back on the show.
Yes, it's actually, for the listeners, maybe one day I'll post the original episode 10 on Patreon or something, because we had an episode 10 already. It's just that the United States Air Force was plotting against me and ruined the audio. Or maybe I just didn't pick a good day to do it, one of the two. So, without any further ado, we'll jump right into our first story for the week. Actually, a good thing that we're doing some more re-recording of this, because as I suspected when I originally recorded, this story has changed quite a bit. In the meantime, a police officer in Dallas has been in the middle of quite the controversy. So, police officer Amber Glier was off of her shift. I guess she had clocked out. She was going home. She was still in uniform. She went to her apartment complex, went to apartment, opened the door, and found a man sitting in what she believed was her apartment. Of course, this was not her apartment, and said man was Botham Jean. It was his apartment. She had gone to the long door. We're not totally sure what transpired afterwards, as there were only 2 witnesses to this scene, and only one of them left the scene alive. So, according to the investigation now that the Texas Rangers conducted, I guess she's claiming she gave some verbal commands to Mr. Jean. He did not comply, which, of course, strange person walks into your apartment. I'm not complying with somebody who walks into my apartment and starts giving me orders. I'll go ahead and say that.
Yeah, this whole situation is insane. From, honestly, the official version of the story that seems to be going around doesn't really make any sense to me. Why was she at the wrong apartment? Why was she on the wrong floor? From what I've heard reported, her apartment complex was the kind that uses electronic key cards to get into your unit, and it's like a hotel. If you put the wrong key card, the wrong RFID chip or whatever, if you put the wrong key card on the lock, it flashes red. So in order for this story to make sense, she would have had to go to the wrong floor of the building, go to the wrong unit, use her key, see that it didn't work, bang on the door, demanding to be let in. The door opens. Somehow she still thinks this is her apartment, and some altercation, some incident takes place, and she pulls her gun and shoots this man down. None of that makes any sense at all. Why the hell was she even there? I've heard speculation that maybe she was drunk or something. That seems to be maybe the argument that they're trying to put forward. But man, this story is wild. This is, this is top 5 worst police shootings I've heard of. And honestly, the fact that I have a top 5 just shows you how bad this problem is.
Yes, it's a completely absurd situation, and I was actually not aware of the key card thing. That makes it even worse. In my mind, it had been that he just left his apartment unlocked and she just went in by accident.
No, it was a locked unit. It was a locked unit with electronic key cards.
That really expands on the story and makes it even more bizarre. I had also heard that she might have been drunk or something like that, which seems a poor excuse to me, if you ask me. That why would she be drunk in the first place? So that would mean she was drunk on duty.
While carrying a gun, intoxicated to the point she doesn't know her own apartment, in uniform. This is completely unjustifiable, which is, honestly, I was surprised, but they did actually press charges. She's being charged with manslaughter, which I'd rather see murder, but, we'll see what the prosecutors come up with. We just hope it doesn't disappear into some grand jury where they decide that the cop was immune from any liability for this incident. But if she was on any sort of substance, if her mindset was in any way altered, if she was off duty, then this might finally be a case where we have a police shooting result in a actual punishment for a police officer. I'm not holding my breath, but we can hope.
Definitely. I think, and of course this has been quite the wild ride watching. I know when I was watching this on Friday, the Dallas police chief was saying, okay, we're going to get a warrant for manslaughter. And then the Dallas police chief backed down and said, no, the Texas Rangers are involved now, so we're going to get the Texas Rangers involved. I guess after that investigation by the Texas Rangers, they did go ahead and do that manslaughter charge. I know I've seen a lot of people upset about that manslaughter charge, and I'm of two minds on it. There's the fact that, this obviously, in my mind, and what I've seen legally at least, manslaughter is usually for things that you kill somebody without necessarily the intent to kill. How I described it previously was that if you're fighting with your brother and you push him down a flight of stairs, that's manslaughter. That's not murder, because your intent was to do harm, but not necessarily to kill. In this instance, by drawing a gun is lethal force. There's no way around it. A gun is always lethal force.
That's why if you are in a self-defense situation and you use a gun to defend yourself, it's the legal advice that I've heard is that it's generally inadvisable to shoot to wound, because the fact that you drew a gun is inherently lethal force. By drawing a gun, you are saying that you believe that this was a situation where lethal force is justified. If you then choose instead simply to wound someone, then that shows that you were intentionally wounding them when it wasn't necessary. Because of that, firearms are just so... Sorry, I lost the track there. Firearms are inherently lethal force. If you use one in self-defense, it will always be lethal force, even if the person isn't killed, and it has to rise to the standards of lethal force, and if it doesn't, then it's murder. A civilian would be charged with murder in this incident, particularly if they were a person of color. And one last wrinkle in this, I've seen this on Twitter. I don't know how thoroughly verified this is, but allegedly members of this officer's family are white supremacists. I believe it was her father or stepfather or someone is photographed with a 1488 tattoo or throwing up a white power sign. The various photos going around on social media. I don't want to get into a, detectives of Reddit, Boston bomber situation, and go jumping off, but there is the potential element of white nationalism with another white police officer killing another person of color. And this whole incident really just encapsulates almost all of the elements of the out-of-control police violence in this country over the past decade. And I just really hope something comes of this, even if she doesn't get charged with murder. Absolutely should be charged with manslaughter at a minimum. But I would just say that it might be the cynic in me, but, I don't think that there will be a conviction or any effect on her career unless she is found to have been intoxicated. I think that our legal system will tolerate almost any level of violence against a person of color by a police officer, but I think our country is puritanical enough, and especially Texas, that we take alcohol pretty seriously in terms of drinking on the job. That capitalists, that sort of puritanical work ethic. If you're working, you need to be focused on your work and not, inebriated in any way. I think that is ultimately what will seal her fate. Is if she was drunk, then they'll determine that she was outside of department policy and this and that, and she'll see the punishment. But if she was sober, even though in a way that makes her more culpable, I think it's more likely that she'll get off. That's just my opinion, but we'll see how it plays out.
Definitely. Well, we can turn our eyes to an instance where it does appear that a police officer is seeing some justice. We have a story out of California, Pasadena, California, where a police lieutenant has pled guilty to federal firearms charges. The background on this case is that Police Lieutenant Vaskin Gordikian apparently had made him the business so this was something that I was not aware of until this story came up to me. It's just one of those things that it blows my mind thinking about.
So, Lieutenant Gordikian got in trouble first with the state authorities and then with federal, for the illegal distribution of firearms without a license. Now, the firearms laws here in California are they're a bit restrictive. We have essentially a whitelist for what handguns you're allowed to purchase in California. They call it the handgun roster. And it's basically an extortion scam against firearms manufacturers. You have to pay, X amount of dollars every year to have your gun tested, or not every year, but you have to have your gun tested by the state of California. It's $20,000. And that you have to do it for each individual SKU. If Glock wants to sell, the Glock 17 in California, they pay the money, they get it tested, and then, but then if they want to sell another version of the Glock 17, say this one has an olive colored frame, or, it's just a different color, or, it's, even if it's the same physical gun, the fact that it's a different SKU means it needs to be put through the same safety test. That has to go through the same $20,000 fee. It's just this huge racket to try to restrict the sale of guns into California and to extract money from firearms companies who want to do so. So Californians are really restricted in what handguns we can buy. The list gets smaller every year because companies don't want to invest the money. It's really a big issue. However, the way around this law is that in certain circumstances and with certain groups of people, you can buy a gun that is off roster. For instance, if you live in Oklahoma, say, and you buy whatever handgun you like there, if you move to California and you bring those guns with you, as long as they adhere to other California laws, like you have a 10-round magazine and, it's above a certain size and all these other restrictions, if you bring those guns with you, you can still legally keep them even if they are off roster, and you can then later on sell those privately. Now, you can't act as an importer and just bring truckloads of guns across the border into the state. The CHP will arrest you and you'll go to jail for a very long time. But one group of people that can get away with that is police officers. And in this case, Lieutenant Gordikian was essentially acting as an importer. He was using his status as a police officer to buy off-roster handguns from out of state, import them into the state, and then he would sell those via private party transfers to other people in the area. Now, this is in Pasadena, which is, maybe an hour's drive from me, and I've actually spoken with some of the activists who were involved in uncovering this and bringing this to trial. I won't talk about who they are, because obviously they are unpopular with the police and other groups. But from what I've heard, this actually went a step further than simply, essentially smuggling, bringing in handguns illegally. It went a bit further than that, in that some of the guns that he sold via private party transfers were actually straw purchases, and those guns then went on to be used in gang shootings. So this is a case of a police officer breaking the law to import guns and sell to the general public, and those guns then ending up in the hands of gang members and used in gang violence in poor parts of the San Gabriel Valley and the Inland Empire. And this hasn't been touched on as much in the press, but from what I understand, this was one of the main impetuses to bring this to the attention of the authorities, to bring this to the attention of the press, to make this a story and get this corrupt, officer out of his position. So thankfully now he has submitted himself to federal authorities. The ATF has taken over the case. They're charging him with essentially acting as a dealer illegally without a license. I don't know if they're still going to press the state charges for violating the roster laws and any private party transfer laws that he may have broken. But Fortunately, this was a case due to community activism and local press picking up the story and getting it picked up by the Los Angeles Times and other major news outlets. This officer was forced through community pressure to answer for his crimes, and hopefully we will see a conviction out of this. It seems fairly clear-cut. He sold over 100 firearms in just a couple of years. That far exceeds the realm of just, private casual sales. That is a business at that point. So again, hopefully we'll see the police held accountable.
Well, I think this it's something it's very difficult for me to understand situations like this, because in a state like California that holds itself so highly on its gun control regime and has so many senators and politicians who have come out of the state who just have truly awful ideas about gun control and gun regulation, to then exist in the system where they have specifically carved out these exemptions in the laws. And I think it's real evidence of what the goal of these laws is.
It's just like the situation a few years ago with State Senator Leland Yee dealing weapons to the triads, of all people, selling them rocket launchers imported from overseas to the Chinese gangs in San Francisco, while he voted in favor of assault weapons bans. These laws aren't meant to apply to the bourgeoisie. These laws are meant to apply to the little people, to the workers, to the poor. They want to disarm our communities and make us easier to control, while consolidating additional power in the hands of the people who support them. And that's really the root of all bourgeois gun control.
Certainly. And stuff like this just gives a plain as day evidence of what this really is. And especially, I don't know how it is in places like New York, or New York City particularly, but I can guarantee you that there's a lot less, there's a lot less controls placed on maybe the more wealthy individuals that you can find in a place like New York, or like in this case, police officers. The NYPD has huge latitude and is a department that covers the largest city in America, and they have immense powers that they can very much exploit, especially in a city like New York City, where getting a concealed carry license is immensely difficult.
And it's a lot easier if you're a wealthy property developer. That's the trend here in LA. Property developers, local politicians, celebrities, they get all the concealed carry permits they like. Average citizens, not so much.
Well, that's as good as any of transition to New York. That the next topic is in the same vein, that Governor Cumeo of New York is deep into his campaign now for re-election. And just this week, he received the endorsement of Everytown for Gun Safety. For the listeners who might not know, Everytown for Gun Safety is a pro-gun control advocacy group. They advocate for a wide range of gun control legislation here in America, all across the 50 continuous states and more. I did some digging around and some research on them. I can't find a single gun control law that they did not support. It seems like their entire mission statement is, if it makes it more restrictive to possess a firearm, then they're for it. And they have given their endorsement to Governor Cumeo. He has welcomed it with open arms and said that he will be working as governor, if he is reelected, to push even further gun control in New York State, which already has, as we've mentioned, immense gun control regulations. He's pushing for extended waiting periods to 10 days, firearm purchase age for all firearms raised to 21, so you can no longer get a long gun if you are 18, and then increased red flag laws, So probably following in the precedent of California, where they made it to where your boss can tell the police that you're a dangerous person and have them take your guns away.
And I bet the strike breakers back in the 30s would have loved to have a law like that on their side.
Definitely. The good governor is seeking to basically do everything that every town for gun safety is advocating. And the reason I bring this up, and particularly this group, is that this is one of the largest lobbying groups in America for additional gun regulation, and they make themselves out to be a pro-Second Amendment organization, and they say, well, we support the Second Amendment, but part of supporting the Second Amendment is we have to accept all these different regulations. And like I've said on the show before, the Second Amendment is a convenient tool for our purposes. It's not what we should be relying on. But the problem I have with this is that when people talk about especially a certain kind of, we'll go ahead and say, right-wing gun supporter who clings to the Second Amendment, this is kind of what that's trying to appeal to. But I think it's interesting to note that this organization that is trying to wrap itself up in this terminology also is an umbrella group for a lot of other smaller groups. They've got like a mayor's association, but of particular interest, they have a chief law enforcement officer association within them. And it is very interesting to me that we have this continued support from the right of trying to do stuff like Blue Lives Matter and things like this in reaction to various social movements like Black Lives Matter. And there are a lot of people on the right are very supportive of their police and their state enforcers. But then at the same time, they're also very much against this idea of further gun control when you have organizations like this that they claim to be opposing, but then they're literally one of their core memberships is these chief law enforcement officers from across the country who are consistently the ones pushing for these gun regulations. I know here in Wichita even, the Wichita police were not in favor of when the state went in and preempted Wichita's local gun ordinances. The state passed some preemption laws that made gun laws uniform across the state, and many police chiefs across the state were opposed to that. So it's one of those things. I bring this up because I find it an interesting moment of hypocrisy that it's not like the New York governor is doing this just out of whatever liberal boogeyman the right can conjure up. That he has a lot of supporters in a lot of places that they would consider themselves friend to. But I'll step off my soapbox and we'll transition into some fantastic Elon Musk news. Elon Musk continues to be an excellent, lighthearted topic in these turbulent times that we can all look towards Mr. Musk and say, truly,
what would we do without him?
I don't know. I only make it through my day because I can look at Mr. Musk and say, man, I might have it hard, but this guy, he really knows hardship. His life is pretty terrible. It's an inspiration.
I think I saw him the other day in downtown LA. He was wiping tears from his eyes with $100 bills. Truly
a sad situation. So, Mr. Musk, since his life is very difficult, since he went on and had that TV interview where he said this has been his hardest year yet and has been truly stressful and really, really hard on himself and his relationships and probably his girlfriend. He decided he needed some time. He needed some time away from the work, some time to cool off, blow some steam off, and smoke some weed. So he went to the Joe Rogan show and did exactly that. He got himself some fine whiskey, I believe, and he got himself a joint. And he had himself a good time on air. Meanwhile, while Mr. Musk was having himself a good time on air, his factory workers continue to toil in the factory without a union, as they fight for a union that he has repeatedly opposed and made threats about in the public about them unionizing.
And even more than that, his legal department has targeted union organizers within Tesla and fired them for smoking marijuana. While here's Mr. Musk at the top of the food chain, smoking it up with Joe Rogan. That's nice. Just nice, just really, really shows you Musk's character.
Yes. So I was looking through some Tesla documents that people have pulled up about this. So of course, Tesla has company policies on recreational drug use. They can be summed up as they don't want you to do it. Some people have been making the case that Tesla does actually allow its employees to smoke when they're not on the job. People can just conjure these things out of nowhere because that's really, yes, technically, if you read through the documents, you can come to the conclusion that, okay, it's okay to smoke weed off the job for Tesla. But the problem there is that Tesla's policies, for obvious reasons, insurance mostly, there's no insurance company that's going to underwrite your workers' compensation policy if you aren't doing regular drug tests.
Not for a warehouse where you have people driving forklifts.
Yeah. You can get away with it in some sectors. I know Target, back years ago when I was at Target, they didn't do drug tests, but the stakes are a lot lower at Target as compared to a place like Tesla where you have factory equipment. There's a lot more room for error there, so they get a little more strict on that. So if you get drug tested at Tesla and you test positive for THC, which because THC is a fat-soluble substance, can stick around in your system for weeks to months at a time, depending on how consistent of a smoker you are. If you test positive for that, you're going to be in trouble. You're probably going to get fired, is how that's going to work. So there's no real way around it. And then, in addition to that any random drug test is still going to disqualify you for THC because it is still a illegal drug at the federal level. I don't think it should be. Let's make that very clear. Having weed be illegal at the federal level and at the severity that it is, it's absolutely ridiculous when you look at these things. But even going beside all that, it's very easy to make the case that since Musk went on to this public talk show and he was talking about the company and things like this, that he was representing Tesla in a professional role because he is a salaried worker, and being a chief executive officer, he can very much be said to be representing the company in a lot of different ways in his personal life. Tesla does have a very specific policy about, be it illicit drug use or alcohol or any other impairing substance, while you're on the clock or doing work for Tesla. And there's multiple ways to skin this cat, and either way, Musk's actions are very silly in this context.
I have to love looking at the stock market graph for Tesla. The drop after the Joe Rogan podcast, it's almost a 10% drop. And it recovered a little bit, but that's the steepest I've ever seen Tesla stock decline. And I think they're down something like 20% for the year. I think it's getting to the point where Tesla is in real financial trouble, which is a shame because I think they have a good product. I mean, fundamentally, there's always issues with conflict minerals and all that. But as far as getting this country off of its gasoline dependence, I love what Tesla is doing. The issue is just Musk is a colossal asshole and shouldn't be in charge of this. This is too important of an endeavor for Elon Musk's ego to screw it up. So I think it's entertaining, but it's also kind of a shame to see it go this way. Another perspective to keep in mind is that the United States has been exporting its drug policy to the rest of the world for the last 50 years. There's a bunch of countries in Europe, South America, Africa that never really cared about marijuana until the United States started pushing for these UN resolutions and international, drug regulations to restrict the trade of marijuana. And our government essentially instilled a stigma against marijuana in governments and police agencies around the world. Now, the opinion of American citizens is changing to be more friendly to marijuana, but many of these other countries are still opposed to it. It's very similar to the way that Britain exported homophobic laws to its colonies. And now those colonies are now more homophobic than Great Britain is. It's the same situation with the US and with marijuana, only, so now you get Musk, to get back to the point, you get Musk going up there, on a video broadcast, smoking marijuana as the CEO of a company with international investors that has shopped around. He's talked to the Saudis about getting funding to take Tesla private. I'm sure there's people in Europe and in Africa who are involved. And now he's making the company look bad. He's making himself look bad to all of these international investors. And that's, I think, another big part of why this incident in particular is what's really damaging Tesla's stock value. The taking the company private tweets, the calling the Thai cave diver a pedophile, that whatever it was with Azalea Banks and Grimes, whatever that was about, none of those had the same effect that this did. This, for some reason, him smoking marijuana just really, really tanked his credibility, I think.
Well, and it does come down to the fact that I know the board of directors, this is something that's becoming more public recently as Tesla bleeds its top level executives very quickly. I know in the past couple months, they've lost their chief accountant, they've lost their chief financial officer, they lost their head of human resources, they've lost quite a few executive officers. They just keep bleeding talent. And a lot of that is now coming to light that the board of directors has been very concerned over the past few months that Musk has been using sleeping pills in order to get any sleep. This is so this in conjunction with having a toke or two. I don't think having a toke or two is wrong, but in conjunction with that, and then I guess inside sources in Tesla are saying that when Musk sent out that tweet where he was saying he's taking the company private and he's going to sell it for $420 a stock, which, by the way, I feel really stupid after I didn't catch that the first time, that, selling the company for $420 a stock. Oh, yes, good one, Musk. They apparently, inside sources say that during that time he was on LSD, so those tweets were happening while he was tripping, perhaps.
Well, that's Azalea Banks, and Azalea Banks gets into Twitter drama all the time, and who knows how much of it is true. But
it's definitely not helping. Yeah, it's definitely not helping confidence in Musk's leadership. It is worth noting, to just kind of close this off, that the Department of Justice, being headed by good old Mr. Jeff Sessions of Alabama, he has rescinded some Obama-era Department of Justice rules, saying basically that the federal government will not pursue cases against individuals in states where these drugs have been decriminalized, most commonly marijuana, but I believe some other drugs have been decriminalized in states as well. Basically, Jeff Sessions has reversed this and said the federal government will go after whoever it pleases, because it's still a crime at the federal level. It will be interesting to see if Jeff Sessions, who really hates marijuana, he's quite famous now, quite infamous, we'll go ahead and say, that for saying that he was completely okay with the KKK until he found out that they liked weed. Hating black people and lynching black people, it's okay with Jeff Sessions, but if you smoke a joint, he draws the line there. So that's how strongly he feels about this. It'll be interesting to see especially since Musk has gotten on the bad side of the Trump administration on a couple of points, if he will take this opportunity to maybe go after a public figure to try to prove that the rich aren't above the rules, when in reality it would be serving a political rivalry, but it would be...
Oh my god. Can you imagine the reaction of the Elon Musk fans? The stands who just worship Elon Musk and the ground he walks on? Can you imagine the reaction if he was arrested by the feds for smoking pot? I mean, I know that would be a horrific, near-fascist overreach of federal power, but on the other hand, I kind of want to see it just for the salt.
I think the tears could lay laced the entire Midwest, I think, if that happened. We'll see how the situation develops. We'll see if Sessions takes the bait or not. I'm personally of the mind he won't, because that's getting pretty far out there, even for Sessions. But we'll keep an eye on it. I'm sure we'll have plenty of Musk news to talk about next week, anyways. Sticking in Silicon Valley, we move to the next story of Google. So, for the listeners, and tying into the continuing segment of Alex complains about how the Russia episode is just consuming all of his research and destroying my Google search analytics, because now every time I search anything, it gets me Russia. The Senate is having a meeting about Russia, the Senate Intelligence Committee to be specific. They are meeting over whether or not the Russians interfered in the election, and possibly other foreign agents. As part of this, they have invited, since they didn't subpoena it, technically it's not a demand, but still a firm invite that they asked various Silicon Valley companies, various internet companies, to attend the meeting to discuss vulnerabilities in their platforms. So folks like Twitter and Facebook showed up. The chief executive of Twitter and the chief operating officer of Facebook appeared before the committee to discuss their respective platforms. Google was also invited, of course. Specifically, Larry Page was invited. Google apparently did not want to send their top man, though. Larry Page said he had other arrangements, and I guess when you're that rich, you can tell the Senate to go do whatever. So instead of maybe calling out Sundar Pichai and saying, hey, go appear before the Senate, Google selected a senior vice president of global operations to go before the Senate Intelligence Committee. The Intelligence Committee felt this was very rude on Google's part that they did not send a chief officer, and so they told the vice president of global operations of Google that he can just stay home, and instead just left Google's seat empty with a nice little placard that said Google next to that empty seat. And all the senators present made sure to get all of their best ribbings in on Google. Well, Google wasn't there to defend itself.
If there's one thing parliamentary politics is good for, it's just seeing grown men be ridiculously petty in a formal setting. That stunt with Google, it doesn't amount to anything. There's no real world consequence, at least that can be discerned from our place in this society. But I do think it's entertaining to see that sort of a level of pettiness coming out of the Senate.
Yes, they do like to get their ribbons in when they can. It's interesting to me because it's a sign of things on both sides, I think. Because on one side, Google, as a guy who tries to keep an eye and an ear on the internet world and see what these big companies are doing and making motions in this area, I don't know what Google thought they would obtain by sending still a senior level manager within their company, but by not sending an executive or a director or somebody of that sort, I don't know what they anticipated. It's not like Sundar Pichai had anything else to do. I'm sure he's a very busy man, but you can make time out of your schedule to go sit down at some random Senate committee hearing, especially one.
It was definitely deliberate, because even if Larry Page couldn't make it, they could have found someone in the C-suite who could make the time to go to DC. This was very obviously a deliberate snub by Google towards the Senate, probably in response to Trump complaining about Google search not being fair to conservative sources. It was probably a deliberate decision, but again, what are they trying to accomplish? I don't get it.
Yeah, I think Google is existing in such a weird position right now, and especially with this Senate Intelligence Committee hearing. The whole point of this committee hearing and having Facebook and Twitter there as well is that the committee was exploring how foreign companies and organizations were able to purchase ad space. And so that's one of the reasons Google was invited, was they're saying, well, foreign individuals have purchased ads on Google's, and they're interfering with our elections by doing that. And it's one of those things. I think Google, there's got to be somebody at Google who can come up with a good response to this. I mean, they have teams of lawyers and experts that I'm sure somebody in there can write up a response. But I do think it's something that Google, in a way, just isn't prepared for, because Google has been kind of running on this notion that if they can get big enough and strong enough and rich enough, fast enough, then eventually they just don't have to listen to these government authorities anymore. And in a sense, that's true, that they have such a huge market share. It's getting on the bad side of Google is not a good idea. At the same time, Google is in a very precarious situation because they've been dealt several significant blows in the European Union. The European Union has really started to crack down on Google, especially with the GDPR stuff coming out, and then the fines Google received in the billions and billions of dollars that actually are felt at the company level. That the European Union has really set their fines at a high level now. I think it's very strange that Google would snub the Senate in this, especially if it's just as a sort of dig at Trump. But at the same time, I feel like it might be simultaneously a snub on their part, as well as maybe evidence that they don't have a good response to what about selling foreign ads, because I don't think there is a good response in this instance, because no matter what you say, the Senate's going to tear it apart. No matter if you, I don't think there's a good way to spin this to the committee, because the Senate committee obviously has an agenda, and it's an agenda across both parties, in my opinion, that a lot of these folks are from the political family, that they very much are representatives of the status quo. And one thing that Trump is a sign of and an outgrowth of is that we live in times where the status quo is being challenged by both leftist and reactionary politics. And Trump happens to be of that reactionary brand. And so you have a lot of folks in the Senate that would be very interested in getting these companies on their side to help restore the status quo. Oh, something good to bring up as well. Just kind of funny that, so as we now know, Alex Jones has been removed from Twitter. Twitter finally got upset with him and got him removed after all this waiting. So, of course, since Twitter was here before the Senate, Alex Jones decided he was going to tag along to make his complaints about Twitter, because he was going to tell the Senate Intelligence Committee about how Twitter was biased against conservatives. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but Marco Rubio, no fan of Marco Rubio, but even awful people can have some good put downs every now and then, and Rubio put down Alex Jones pretty epically. basically told him to get out of the Senate with his nonsense.
Right. So the actual story is that Alex Jones confronted Rubio in a hallway of the Capitol building and tried to get a statement out of him. And Rubio just shut him down and said, "Don't touch me," and just sort of like blocked him out and just walked the fuck away from him. Just walked away from him. And apparently there was some other drama actually in the Senate chamber. There was some heckling going on. I don't know. God, at this point, Alex Jones at this point is basically just a parody of himself. He's just he's just a deluded old man yelling at the cloud for not being kind enough to him. You know, he's totally off. He's totally off his rocket. He's just. I'm really interested to see where Alex Jones is going to go next. I don't think it's going to be Twitter, though.
Yeah, we'll see. He's got himself kicked off of pretty much every platform out there. So, but just as the Alex Jones rants about anything and everything, particularly the deep state, another man is ranting about the deep state. It's just that we seem to take him more seriously for some reason. Steve Bannon is back in the news. So, as some may be aware, Trump has been having a real hard time with his administration recently. People don't much like Trump, whether they're in or out of the White House. Trump's not very popular, except for places he is, I guess. And that seems a weird statement, but pockets of popularity everywhere. So there was most recently a New York Times op-ed from an anonymous senior source within the White House. And basically this was a really damning story about what's going on at the Trump White House. And this comes at a time when we have that book Fear out right now, detailing all of the nonsense that's going on in the Trump administration. So Bannon wrote his own response and said, it's actually a coup from the deep state. The deep state is working against Trump. And I think this is an instance of not necessarily the broken clock being right twice a day, but just that I think Bannon is playing into something. That Bannon is very much a man of reactionary politics, and this is a man who has called for modern day crusades. He's a very bizarre and sometimes frightening individual. And I think one of the problems here is that I do think that there are individuals working against Trump within his administration. I don't have any reason to believe that there isn't. I don't have reason to believe that these stories we hear of people in his administration actively sabotaging him are false. I just don't think that's necessarily a deep state like these far right conspiracy theorists will say.
When you talk about the deep state, the original idea that was behind it is that you have this, sort of bureaucratic core to the government, these department heads and administrators and these career bureaucrats in these unappointed positions, unelected. They just, they rise up through the ranks and they actually handle most of the day-to-day business of the government. Elected officials set the policy, but it's up to the bureaucracy to carry it out. And the real genius behind the deep state conspiracy theory, which was constructed, or at the very least promoted by Bannon, the idea behind it is that these bureaucrats are the real power behind the throne, that these are this is the real government and everything else is just for show. Which in a sense is very proletarian, the bourgeois, politicians aren't the real ones in control. It's the people who actually are in charge of the direct actions of the government that hold the real power. I think there's some unconscious socialism going on there, buried deep down below the conspiracy theories. But what they're talking about here, calling this New York Times op-ed and these Woodward stories about people thwarting Trump's ambitions, calling that the deep state, that's not what they originally called the deep state, because these are people who are part of Trump's cabinet who are working against him. These are people who are, appointed directly by Trump. These aren't necessarily bureaucrats who are preventing these policies from reaching Trump's desk. These are actual, administration officials who were chosen by Trump and his team to carry out these duties. And what it is Bannon is changing the definitions behind his conspiracy theory to adapt it to a new circumstance. Bannon's lost most of his power. He's completely irrelevant. I think what he's trying to do with this response and with trying to come back into the public eye, I think he's trying to build up his image again. And I think this is a reformulation of the deep state conspiracy theory to make it more relevant, to make Bannon more relevant, to make Breitbart more relevant, basically to help this, slimy eel of a, liver spot worm his way back into public discourse and promote his far-right agenda. But, it's definitely not the same idea of the deep state that they promoted in the past. This is a new version of it.
Definitely. I think your analysis is pretty good, that this is all just kind of the deep state that Bannon is talking about here is just, it's just the status quo. It's always been there. It's just, there's a natural inertia to these things. And so, of course, government officials aren't going to want to have the radical change. And part of the two-party system is that both parties more or less run things the same way. They might have different policies, but they run things the same way, whereas Trump has been shaking things up and reforming things in his image, reactionary as it is. And of course there's resistance and pushback to that. It's changing a lot of what people have come to expect within the government system. Kind of moving off of this and off the tracks of the show notes, but we're going into bold, unexplored territory because a SRA member in the member-only Slack that we have for SRA members, please become a member of the SRA to join it. It's fun, great time. Has sent me a message. We're going to do a live.
We gotta call in.
Yes, it's the best I can do right now. It's actually here in my very own state. From Fairleigh, Kansas. We have a story that just came out tonight concerning a woman by the name of Gwyneth Barbara. So this is actually serves not only as a local story, but also a follow-up to the previous episode where we were discussing passport denials. So listeners may remember that we were discussing how passports were being denied along the border to various Latino citizens, and that we said we have to really keep an eye on this because this could get really bad really fast. And apparently things are getting worse faster than I could even imagine. It's only been a week or two and we're already seeing stuff like this. So this woman, Gwyneth Barbara, said she was born and raised in Kansas. Both her parents were U.S. citizens. Looking at this picture, I don't claim to be able to tell people's ethnicities by sight. Sometimes that can be really confusing. She seems to be your regular white middle-aged woman, though. Apparently, when she was born in the 1970s, she was born at home, at a home birth, and that's very common, especially here in Kansas. There's a lot of home births. My wife was born at home, so it's very common here in Kansas. They don't always go to the hospital or something. Her father got her birth certificate like you do, and since it is very common in Kansas, this is not an uncommon occurrence. I'm going to keep stressing on this because this is really important. It's not uncommon for children to be born at home with very little, sometimes even none, medical supervision. Usually there's midwives or something there, but she applied for her passport, and then she received a letter back with her passport application saying that her birth certificate was not valid. That because it was a at-home birth certificate and there was no witnesses to it, it couldn't be considered valid, even though her father had done the correct thing and gone down to the courthouse and said, I had a child, and done all the procedure required for a birth certificate, and it was as official a birth certificate as they come, straight from the state. It was still denied by the authorities. And in the letter she was given, it's one of those stock federal form letters. And so it was saying, how do you prove that you're a citizen? Well, do your parents have the green card or citizenship paperwork from when they came to the U.S.? And of course, her parents were born in the U.S. They're U.S. citizens by birth. And so, of course, they don't have that. And if they're not going to recognize your birth certificate anyways, then how does that work? So she was really struggling to get any documentation to prove that she was a citizen, because that's how I proved I was my citizenship to get my passport was I sent in my birth certificate. I don't know any other way to do that, because that's how you prove who your parents are anyways. I don't know how you would do it any other way. So she was really having a struggle. She ended up having to contact Senator Moran here in Kansas. Senators and congressmen can sometimes help their constituents with these issues. I guess the senator pulled some strings in Washington, and she ended up getting her passport issued to her. But it's interesting to note that this article then goes on to say, according to federal policy, there is no standing policy about a birth certificate needing to be officiated at a hospital or by a medical official or somebody like that. It's that system is not in place because, again, in Kansas, it's very common, and across many Midwestern states, it's very common for at-home births to take place. So, of course, there couldn't be a policy against this, but now we're seeing an administration that's taking advantage of the system. And for this to start affecting inland, not on the border, but just some random woman in Kansas, what does that say?
I can't comment on this. I'm a trans woman with an uncorrected birth certificate engaged to a Mexican immigrant. This is too close to home. I can't speak on it.
Fair enough. We'll leave that for the listeners to contemplate. And it's amazing. Again, this article it came out just recently. And I said today, I will correct myself, it came out on the 10th, but I'm now just hearing about this. It's flabbergasting. It's absolutely outrageous.
It's pretty much blood and soil in policy form taking shape here. So this is something that I'm concerned about. This is something we need to keep an eye on. You might think that you're born in this country, your citizenship is assured. That might not be the case. So just be careful, folks. Check up on where your documents are at. Make sure, they're up to date. Make sure you have everything you need. It's getting scary out there.
Most definitely. Yep, we'll get back onto the train tracks of this podcast and finish up with our last story of the night that we have, even as Steve Bannon is talking about a coup within the Trump administration, the Trump administration was planning a few coups, as it looks like. So Trump administration officials met with coup planners in Venezuela. Some military officials down there in Venezuela are not happy with the current situation, probably because they can't exploit people as much as they would like to. The military has been running a lot of black market stuff down there that their activities are coming under more scrutiny from the Venezuelan authorities, and now they're getting upset about that. So some disgruntled military officers met with the Trump administration on 3 different occasions to discuss the possibility of a coup attempt against the current Venezuelan President Maduro. Apparently, they didn't pursue anything after that. This is interesting to note that Trump has repeatedly asked about what he can do about Venezuela, repeatedly asked why he can't just kill President Maduro, repeatedly asked why we can't invade Venezuela, a full-blown invasion force of the country. He has been rebuffed by his own officials on this, just because sounds such like a lunatic when he talks about stuff like this.
I think the only administration official backing him on this is John Bolton, aka an actual character from Game of Thrones, apparently, who is basically an insane war hawk who wants us to go to war with everyone. As far as I'm aware, that's the only other person in the Trump administration pushing for action against Venezuela. But at least from what I've been picking up from the Hill and Politico and those other rags, the impression I'm getting is that Trump's chief of staff is keeping Bolton isolated away from Trump to stop those ideas from getting through his mental haze.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning, especially since people like the Defense Secretary Mattis have told Trump, well, that's not how we do things. We do things other ways. And it's very concerning it came out that Mattis was telling Trump about these alternative methods. And then a couple months later, we have these drone attacks from a previously almost irrelevant insurrectionary group within Venezuela that I had never heard of them before. I never heard of them before that happened, and apparently they are not any significant political force within Venezuela, but this random group just suddenly gets its hands on C4 and drones and attempts to assassinate Maduro with it, after the U.S. and its president is trying to find ways to deal with its Venezuelan problem. And that's... I don't know. I think it's a very strange position to be in, especially with America's history of Venezuela. Certainly, it seems clear that Trump, for some reason, just really has something out against Maduro. I can't quite figure out why. Of course, the meme is to say it's the oil. Venezuela has oil, so of course America has to go appropriate it. Anywhere there's brown people in oil, it's that America feels the need to get involved, and maybe there's that. I feel like that Trump's got to have some personal vendetta, though, for him to be so focused on this, especially when he's gone to places like North Korea, and you can really see a change in his rhetoric after his visit to North Korea, that now he talks about Kim Jong-un in glowing, endearing terms, that he's really impressed by Un's power and displays of power and such. Whereas Maduro, he shows no such thing to Maduro. I don't know if they've actually met yet. Maybe that's the key here. They haven't met yet, so he hasn't seen Maduro's full displays of power to be in all of, but I feel like there's got to be something personal going on here for him to be so obsessed with this that he's repeatedly brought the subject up.
Again, I think I'm going to blame Bolton on that, as well as, half a century worth of anti-communist propaganda. I really think that it's obviously Trump has no issue with authoritarians. He loves authoritarians. So any reason that he would have to hate Maduro or to hate the Venezuelan government on authoritarian grounds, on them being an inhumane dictatorship or whatever, is obviously bunk. I think he's just upholding the foreign policy line that his advisors want him to push, and I think sometimes he gets a bit too dramatic and a bit too militant about it, and his handlers have to pull him back and stop him from accidentally starting a major war over Twitter.
It's a situation I definitely don't want to see us get involved in a war down in Venezuela, because that's going to end good for exactly no one.
Oh, it'll end well for someone. It's going to end really well for ExxonMobil and Phillips 66 and British Petroleum. It's going to end really well for them.
This is true. We'll have to keep an eye on the situation and see. And I do hope that Venezuela can begin to recover from its economic problems that it's been facing, and hopefully can get into a stronger position to be able to deal with this potential threat, especially since its neighbors on the borders of Colombia are not very friendly to it either. So they've got multiple situations to worry about right now, and certainly they don't need to be worried about a contingent of U.S. Marines paying them a visit either. So that would not be a good turn of events for them. Would not be. Well, in the kind of the conclusion to this episode, we've got a funny meme that has come up with Venezuela, actually, and kind of as we close out this episode, is that for some listeners who may not be aware, there's a common occurrence on the internet for conservative Facebook meme pages mostly to post pictures of Venezuela, since Venezuela is undergoing an economic crisis right now. So they will post pictures of empty storefronts and say, "Oh, look, this is what socialism gets you. Why would anyone want socialism? Why would anyone want socialism when this is what socialism gives you? Empty stores. This is all socialism can give you." It's the reason this is funny is because these pictures are repeatedly, if you just do reverse Google image search, we have the technology. We've had the technology for a while. You can search images and find out where they came from. And if you search these images, you'll find out that they actually come from American stores. And what times do American stores empty out? Well, none other than hurricane time. So when there's a major disaster incoming, be it a hurricane or an ice storm or something, people will wipe out these stores. And those stores just do not have the stock to replenish in time before the storm hits.
And speaking of,
there's a storm coming right now. Hurricane Florence is on its way to the East Coast. Let me pull up the most recent trajectory. We've got a whole thing in the member-only Slack for the SRA that's keeping track of this. We have a whole channel dedicated to the organization effort because the SRA is actually organizing an effort around this. We understand that there's going to be a lot of people and a lot of comrades who are in the line of the storm. The most recent models have it hitting dead on with South Carolina. So it's going to affect South Carolina. It's going to affect Georgia. It's going to affect North Carolina. It'll probably affect Virginia. It'll probably go deeper inland. It's looking like it's going to stall is the current projections. It's going to hit the land and stall. So we'll see how that ends up turning out. But we are organizing an effort to help people, to deliver supplies, deliver food, deliver water, deliver whatever we need. We have a GoFundMe started right now to help with this effort. We've got people and trucks and radio operators who we're getting ready to be able to go out into the storm, help people, maybe help with the evacuation effort, help people who maybe don't have the supplies, who need fresh water, because that's going to be the biggest thing. If you're listening to this and you're on the East Coast, if your stores have anything left, get water. Get water, or if you don't, start bottling tap water. Find something to bottle your tap water with before the storm surge comes through and ruins it all. If you have a water purifier, even better. That'll be even better. But you need to start stockpiling water is the biggest thing.
So we're currently organizing specifically our Georgia chapter, plus some volunteers from other states. We're trying to put together an effort to send out a couple of trucks with supplies to wherever it seems like they're needed. There's a couple options, Charleston or perhaps the Carolina coast, or possibly even remaining within Georgia. The current projections are that the storm will basically stall against the Appalachians, and it might possibly drift south, and it could end up dumping, a foot of water or more on Atlanta, which could wreak all sorts of havoc. So we've established a GoFundMe trying to raise money for this effort. We're trying to raise $1,000. If we can raise more, all the better. So far, we have $475. The Central Committee is currently holding a vote to see how much money that we want to dedicate from the org's general fund. Probably going to put in a few $100s from that to help buy supplies. When this is over, we're going to reimburse our members for purchasing these supplies and driving them into the affected area. Any gasoline, anything they need to carry this operation out. Afterwards, any leftover funds will be dedicated to a charity or to a relief organization that does this more professionally, and we'll donate these funds directly wherever it seems they'll do the most good. So the link for the GoFundMe page, it's gofundme.com/hurricane-florence-SRA-relief. Again, we've raised $475 so far out of 1,000. We have a few hundred more coming from the organization. We're really going to be putting a lot of resources and effort into this. Our Georgia chapter is organizing, and I believe Alex is getting involved in this as well, aren't you?
I am. So thanks to the generosity of a private donation, I will be able to obtain the funds to drive out. So probably Friday morning. I'm looking at this projected. That's looking like probably Atlanta is going to get hit late Friday. So I might actually start the journey on Thursday. Kind of depends on, I have some business here at home to deal with. But either Thursday or Friday, early Thursday or early Friday, I'll be driving out to Georgia to help assist the Georgia chapter and lend a hand to the folks out there that are going to be going into the storm. And I'll be bringing some supplies of my own and some gear to contribute to the cause. So depending on how that goes, I will be most heavily working with our Georgia chapter guy, Brad, a previous guest on the show. As it would happen, I could talk to him about doing the next episode of this podcast. And so we might, because I'll be up there over the weekend, we might actually be recording this next episode of the podcast during the storm. So
AlexHumva on location, ground zero of Hurricane Florence.
Recording live from the eye of the hurricane.
Well, I hope you have a safe journey. I hope you and the rest of the volunteers stay safe during the storm. I hope we can get out there and provide some mutual aid to the people impacted by this natural disaster.
Definitely, I think this is going to be a real good thing, and I think this is something that I've really pushed for the organization since pretty much day one. That my thought when I was working on making the Wichita chapter was disaster relief. We haven't had too much in the way of tornado season here yet. Not too much to report, but I'm sure it's going to get picked up here, and I think this is going to be a good trial run for the organization as a whole to see what we need to do and how we can help, and for future events like this, we can only get better. Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and conclude the podcast. So to you, Faye, I bid you a good night, and to the listeners, seize the means of production.
Good night, everybody. Solidarity forever.